Hi, welcome back. My name is Peter Case, and I have been an Agile coach for a number of years. And before I was an Agile coach, I've been a project manager and a Scrum Master. I've been a product owner and a product manager. And so I love talking about Agile things. Interestingly enough, that's not really the impetus behind why I started doing these. I started doing these because I've always wanted to learn how to do video editing, because I love learning new things. And at the same time, in my work, there are so many times where I'll have the same question. For example, today's topic: how do I begin story pointing? And you get those so frequently that I've always thought, man, if I could create some content around that so that I could send people to something that's self-help, that could be awesome. And there are a lot of great videos out there and a lot of great content out there. Um, and so for me, this is about learning as well as providing my own insights. Anyway, but today I wanted to talk about how to begin story pointing. Now, story points are kind of an interesting thing. Here's the thing with story pointing. Really what we're doing is we are comparing the relative effort, complexity, knowledge, and certainty of one work item to another, right? So that's the context. And that's also really important because a lot of leadership will try to equate one team's story points to another and use that as a productivity measure. The problem with that is that every team's story points and their average velocity are very context specific. Whether it's that their solution is a lot more complex, their people are a lot more knowledgeable in that one particular area, or just how they begin understanding what a one story point is versus a three story point. Everything is different. So avoid the temptation, if you're a manager, to compare teams' story points against one another. If you do that, and especially if you do that for reporting, what will happen is that teams will begin goosing their story point estimates. What was a one story point will now become a three, just because they want to get you off their back. A better metric, if you're actually looking for that sort of thing, is called flow predictability. And that is, over a period of time, how often do we complete our sprint estimates or complete our sprint goals relative to what we had planned. And that becomes a percentage, right? So over 3 months, in a 3-month period of time, you're going to have 6 sprints. Over 6 sprints, how many times did you achieve your sprint goals versus not? And it becomes a percentage game. Now, when you're doing that, I'll just end with this. When you're doing that, you're looking for a sweet spot around 80% of the time. You don't want to get constantly above 100% of the time, because if a team is always accomplishing more than they had intended to do or they had planned to do, number one, they're probably under planning so that they don't get yelled at, so that they can be the heroes and always over deliver. What we want them to do is be honest with how much work they think that they can do. And so if they're always over delivering, it tells me that they're not estimating for themselves, they're estimating for vanity. That's a problem, because you're never going to get a true understanding of what a team wants to do or can do if they're not being honest with their estimates. If a team is constantly below 80%, it means that their eyes are too big for their stomach. They're always overloading their sprints and just not accomplishing it, which means that they're not reflecting in their retrospectives on what they had intended to do versus what they can do, and what they can try, what experiments they can try to do better, right? So you always want around that 80% range as far as predictability is concerned. So back to story pointing. How do we begin? And the story point does not equate to a unit of time. So a one story point doesn't equate to a half a day or 1 day or whatnot, which means that we're really relatively sizing the work against one another. So generally what I'll do is I'll take all the items in my sprint backlog or my product backlog, and I will look at it and ask my team, of all of these work items, what is the smallest or easiest to do, the thing that we have the most confidence in and the most knowledge in. We'll give that a 1. And then we'll go ahead and everything else will be relative to that 1. You might have 3, 4, 5 1s in your product backlog and some 3s and stuff like that. That's perfectly fine. In our example here, what we're looking at is toys, and we're going to use that as an activity. And we're saying the relative size of toys, because we want to fit as many toys in our toy box as possible. And as we look at that, well, it's pretty easy to say The little pile of Legos there is a one-story pointer. And now that we've got our very first point of data, everything else should be a lot easier. Okay, so relative to Legos, what's the next smallest? Probably He-Man. Now, is He-Man twice as big? 3 times as big as that pile of Legos? We don't want to get too scientific, right? We just want to kind of get in the ballpark. We're going to say it is 2 story points. And then we go on from there. The football. The football is probably a little bit bigger than twice the size of He-Man, so we'll give that a 5. And we can go on from there. Really easy stuff. The couple things that I would encourage you to avoid, however, when you're story pointing, is as your stories get bigger, they become more complex. And really there's kind of this correlation between when the bigger the story points, the less accurate your estimate is going to be, right? So we always encourage teams to decompose their stories as much as they can. And there are different techniques that you can apply to breaking your user stories. But one of the anti-patterns that we see that I want to encourage you not to fall into is breaking the story apart by development and testing. Now, the reason that's a problem is, remember, a user story is something that can be potentially shippable within one sprint. Well, if something is not tested, it's not potentially shippable. So you can't decompose the story like that, development and testing, because the development side is not potentially shippable. So there are other ways, and we call it kind of vertical slicing, there are other ways that you can decompose your work there. So I encourage you to look at those. I can do a video on those if you want, the different tips and tricks for story splitting, and that's also kind of a fun muscle for your teams to build as well. I do hope this was helpful, and if there are things that, if you have questions or if there are other topics that maybe you want me to hit on, put it down in the comments, and I would love to help any way I can. Thanks so much.